Hello, I'm Shelly Cline, historian and director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. The talk you're about to hear was originally given on June 22nd, 2023 in the Jewish Community Center for the commemoration of Operation Barbarossa. We'd like to remember those lives that were forever changed by the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and its territories in June of 1941. We remember the 1.5 million Jewish women, children, and men murdered in shooting actions and in gas fans. We remember those who went into hiding or fled deeper into the Soviet Union. We remember those who joined partisan units in the forest. And we reflect upon the human loss incurred by invasion and war. When we talk about Operation Barbarossa, we're looking at the largest offensive in human history in military terms. This happened in June of 1941. This is the moment where Hitler breaks his non-aggression pact that he had with the Soviet Union. As many of you probably know, in 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, and then they secretly agreed to divide up the territory of Poland once an invasion happened. And of course, that's exactly what does happen in September of 1939. The Germans invade Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviets come in from the east, and they will take these eastern territories that you see highlighted on the map. And then during over the next year or so, Germany will turn its attention to the west and other parts of Europe, and you can see the territory gained in the west here, which means as of June 1941, Germany is poised to go into the Soviet Union. This non-aggression pact was not meant to hold. Neither the Soviets nor the Germans believed this was going to be a long-standing thing, but it gave them both time to prepare for essentially the inevitable. When we talk about Operation Barbarossa, this move into the Soviet Union, we have to think about it in the context of Germany's war for conquest. So at the same, when we're thinking in Holocaust terms, we're typically thinking about the war against the Jews, and that's part of Germany's racial war. At the same time that they're embarking upon a racial war, they're having this war of conquest for territory, for the living space that they want to expand into. Their primary goal for living space is in the East. It's the Soviet territories. Now, they've already expanded in the West as well, but part of that Western expansion is sort of to, isolate the Soviets so that they can move into this territory that they really want. But it's really important to think about this two-pronged war, that they're always fighting. They're always fighting two wars. You can see this map shows you the movements of the Wehrmacht, the German army, going into Soviet territory. You can see a couple of photos here of what that invasion looks like. And as I said just a few moments ago, when we think about these invasions, it's really important to think about the impact on civilians. The experience of the Second World War was very much one of a civilian experience. Obviously, millions of military personnel were killed, but in most countries, civilian death outnumbered that of military death. So certainly this was the case in the Soviet territories, and you can see that impact upon people living here, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Obviously, the experience is going to be a little bit different, and the Jewish population will experience mass murder and genocide, and the Soviet population will experience the impact of war to a pretty severe degree. As I said, Operation Barbarossa was the largest land military offensive in human history. It requires the mobilization of millions of personnel, hundreds of thousands of vehicles and horses go into this. And you can see too that the Germans moved pretty quickly. This is a part of their blitzkrieg, their lightning war that they're known for in the beginning. They're good as long as they can move quickly. It's later when they they have to fight sort of more stage battles in cities that their tactics are less impactful. There are big losses on both sides, but millions of Soviet soldiers are taken as prisoners and murdered after they've been captured during this invasion. And this photo too, this is showing the impact of some Russian civilians. Their homes have been burned because they've been set fire actually by the Russians, the Soviets themselves, as part of this like scorched earth policy of like leaving nothing behind as they retreat. So again, just something to think about in terms of civilians are not only impacted by sort of the enemies coming in, but by the tactics of essentially their own side. So when German troops move into this Eastern Territory, they're not just moving into Eastern Territory, they're moving into the heartland of Europeans' Jewish population. So this is a useful map to give you a sense of where Europe's Jewish population lives. You can see the population in the West is relatively small, especially that of Germany. It's less than 300,000. But in the Soviet Union and in Poland, this population is in the millions. And so that's important because their policy, once they move into this territory, is going to be very different than what Nazi policy was towards German Jews or Czech Jews, Austrian Jews, that sort of thing. Once they move into this territory that has significant numbers, their policies will become more radicalized. So into this territory, following behind the Wehrmacht, we see these mobile killing units that we know as Einsteins Group. You can see some of the commanders here. If you just take a look at their professions, you can see that they are highly educated. Some of them have doctorates, they're lawyers. One man's the son of a minister. So there's these are led by educated men, and they will go into, they lead their units into towns, villages, cities, finding who's Jewish, moving them usually somewhat outside of town, and then killing them. So we will look at what this process looks like. And I'd also like to say too, this is a moment as we talk about what this procedure looks like, we have to, remember, we know there's over 1.5 million people that were murdered by these units. And it's easy to think in terms of large numbers, but it's really important that we remember the individuality of these people and these victims and not just see it in the total sum. And so here in a minute, we will hear from a couple of survivors of these killing actions and then from witnesses who saw these actions take place. So here's the Wehrmacht path, and then as you can see, really following closely behind these are the Einsteins Group and how they fan out into this Soviet territory. Just a quick graphic to give you a sense of the manpower required for this type of killing action. In the early June 41, when the invasion first starts, relatively few personnel are involved, 3,000 SS men. But as this goes on, as they sort of, move deeper into territory, and as the plan is, continuing, you'll see that the numbers really go up. And so by December, there's 33,000 men involved. There'll be a brief pause because can't bury bodies when the ground is frozen. And then in June, you can see there's a second sweep that happens, and just you can take a look at the total number of people required. This is really important to understand how this fits into the evolving process of the Nazis moving to the final solution. So in June of 41, these killings start. And then in July, we'll start to see there's an actual, there's a decision made at the administrative levels in Berlin about now they're going to proceed to the, into researching methods for the total solution to the Jewish question. So some of this, this killing that's taking place, they're doing it this whole time, and yet there isn't sort of a plan as to how to carry it out across the continent. And one of the things that they look at as they're looking at, solutions as they evolve, is this issue of manpower. It really takes a lot of people to go out over into the Soviet territory. As you can imagine, just thinking about the Soviet map, it's quite large. And this is happening at the same time that this war against the Allies is happening. So the war for conquest is happening, war against the Jews is happening, and Germany is always at a manpower shortage. So one of the real drawbacks to this method of killing and waging war against the Jews is just how many people it takes. So certainly, the Einsteins Group will enlist the help of locals. So it's not just Germans who are doing the shootings in many cases, but it's still something that requires a lot of people and time to move into these spaces. So You can also see on the right side sort of the evolving nature of the victims. So initially, they will kill Jewish people in official positions, largely targeting, but then very quickly that starts to turn into targeting women and children and elderly men as well. So that's really when we can see this sort of moving into the genocidal process, that they're not just looking to target, people who could be potential resistance or fighters. They're really looking to kill everyone who falls within this group. And then you'll see, if you notice at the very bottom as well, during that second sweep, we'll see the addition of gas vans as well. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. So what does this procedure look like? So thinking about that map of the Soviet territory I showed you, the Germans will arrive in these towns following behind the Wehrmacht. They will requisition locals to help for manpower, be it for shooting actions, for digging, for collecting valuables. And they'll also requisition materials, so shovels, wagons, anything that's needed to help with this process. They will show up the night before, do the requisitioning, have the locals in many cases they'll show up. One thing that the Germans do show up with is usually rolls of barbed wire to fence in the sort of Jewish areas of town so that they can't leave. And then oftentimes it's local police that are tasked with, again, policing that to make sure no one tries to escape during the night. There's often a fair amount of violence that happens in this final night. Again, sometimes by the Germans, oftentimes by the locals. We'll see violence, assault, sexual assault that takes place because everyone knows what's coming the next morning. The next morning, the Jews will be taken to the shooting site. The ditches are already prepared. The shootings will happen. Goods and possessions are collected. And then by nightfall, it's really all over. And then the Germans will go back to the town, the base that they came from, and everything can start over the next day in a new town. So if we look a little bit closer at this procedure, there is this, first the location has to be prepared. So this is part of the night before preparations. Here we have just a small quote from a German who was stationed in this territory. He gets a call where he's told that he's going to be in charge of picking the location for this mass grave to be dug. They know exactly how large they want it to be. He just has to go scout the area. And then he will supervise the digging, get locals to do the digging so that everything is prepared by the time the victims will show up. People will be moved from their homes under guard. Again, the local police are heavily involved in helping police this and move people from the site of their homes to the location where the shooting is about to happen. And then valuables will be collected. People brought things with them. So locals help with this as well. And you can see in both these photos some of the belongings that are left behind. And then also before people are shot, they're told to strip. So their clothes are left behind. It's not just the bundles of clothes maybe they brought with them, but it's also the what they're wearing. And then the shooting will happen. You can see there's a couple different types of pits here. Sometimes there'll be a natural ravine that people are shot into. Sometimes it's this special trench that's dug. And you can see there's different methods of shooting. Sometimes it's with rifles, sometimes it's machine guns, sometimes it might be even handguns. So there's just different methods of shooting. And that's something that when witnesses are interviewed decades later, people they're asked sort of what kind of, to get more details on to find out more about what these shooting actions really looked like. You can see just a few more photos here of that. Also notice the fact that we have photos. This is something that either local witnesses took, sometimes the German perpetrators took them, sometimes the collaborators took them. But we have for this being in rural territory and whatnot, we have a fair amount of these photos. It's interesting too when you compare this with, say, like the death camp process at Auschwitz. We have very few photos of any of the death camps actually functioning. We don't see that process photographed. The Auschwitz album is the big notable exception to that. And that's really just the sorting and selection. We're not really seeing into the killing machinery. So it is notable that this killing process, it's relatively well photographed. That was one of the things that problematic, but also think about what it means in terms of those who are witnessing this are compelled to take a photo, for whatever reason, be it as a souvenir of their, as this is something out of the ordinary. But the fact is we have a fair amount of photographic evidence of this. The burial procedure will happen after this. You can see that, again, there's a trench that's been dug. Sometimes the Germans help with this. Oftentimes it's locals that are tasked with doing the burial as well. And the burial, digging the pit would have been hard labor. The filling in of the pit would have been much more grotesque. And people who had to do this describe the difficulty of that, the blood oozing through the soil. This is a really messy method of killing. And certainly that's something too that impacted even the perpetrators. And we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of how that contributes to a shift. But you can see same man here that was talking, he picked the location for the pit. And then here he describes how he felt. He wasn't ordered to go fill in the pit, but he felt like, he'd started this process, so he wanted to go kind of finish it out. Then we see reports like this drawn up. And again, this reminds us of the very bureaucratic, organized nature of this killing process. So even though everything doesn't go smoothly, this is still very organized. And so here we have a report from one of the commanders. He's sending this back to Berlin to be read, to show, like, we know that this territory contained this many Jews. Here's the ones that we've killed, so we can certify that these areas are free of Jews. So you can see the report, and then they've also, for better descriptive purposes, they've drawn up a little bit of a graphic here. So if you don't want to read the numbers, you can see it more visually represented as well. So I always think it's interesting to contrast, the human face of this. We know the human impact, and then how it is in bureaucratic terms, how the perpetrators are seeing this. Here are some of the massacre sites that thus far have been documented. This was done by a group called JUNAMI. I'll say a little bit more about them in a second. But this gives you a sense of kind of the scope of this process. You can see that they get pretty far north, all the way to St. Petersburg, down south, almost to Georgia, and then how heavily concentrated this is in areas of Ukraine. The only difference between the blue and the red dots is the red dots are fully online. So if you went to this website, the JUNAMI's website, you could click on those red dots and it would tell you how many people were killed, witness testimony, that sort of thing. So, and I'll show you a few of the testimonies from witnesses that they've collected. But this really does remind us of the thoroughness of this process. So not all sites are the same. Babiara, and we'll look at testimony from that as well. There's about 33,000 people who were killed there over the course of 2 days. Other sites, another one we'll look at, has 20 people that are killed. And so they really vary between tens of thousands to a handful of people, which again shows you the dedication of these, these killing units, that they weren't just looking for larger populations. Their goal was to find and kill all the Jews that they could. So, like I said, this map was put together by a group called JUNAMI. They're an international group of researchers founded by Father Patrick Dubois, who's a French priest. And one of the things that they're doing is trying to find all of these massacre sites and mark them with GPS coordinates, so people know where they are and document them. And they're also looking to collect testimony from witnesses. And we're going to listen to that testimony from several witnesses here in a minute. Most of the people whose testimony they've collected were children at the time, because this is done so many decades after the war. People who would have been adults or in any way complicit or a bystander who had choices, they're no longer with us, right? Because they were, but if they were adults then, they've probably died since then. So all the testimony I'm going to show you today comes from people who were kids. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You don't have to feel any particular way about, like, these aren't bystanders. These were actually witnesses. They were kids who didn't have, agency to do really anything except watch. And we can learn a great deal from them and what they remember, even small things. And I'll show you just a short clip here to kind of give you a sense of how they do this process and how they're the types of details that they're able to collect, which gives us a more full historical picture. The mission of Yahad and Unum is to record these testimonies. It's to educate people about it. And it's also to engage the world to understand that genocide didn't stop then, right? This is a problem of humanity that continues to this day. The same group is actively working in Ukraine right now to collect testimony from people who've witnessed the atrocities committed by Russians in that territory now. So a really interesting group. And I encourage you to visit their website and see some of the things that they're doing. So I just want to play a quick clip here of a man who was a boy at the time. And I just want you to see how it is that the questions that they ask, the type of information they're trying to get from him, and that technique, I think is pretty interesting.
На колесах, чи його тримали в руках?
В руках тримали.
Пулемет в руках. І один тільки стріляв, виходить.
Кандидат стріляв, а далі другого поставили. Не було другого. Той, що стріляв ще, а другий охраняв. Ленту закладали.
А був якийсь ящик з лентами?
Ящики були.
Дерев'яний ящик був?
Оцього то я не знаю, не скажу.
І тільки два німці було там?
Це тільки навколо пулемета, там було багато німців. Вели, охраняли.
Дивіться, ось це отакі, ось ті, що стріляють. Отакі в них шапки були, чи отакі кашкети?
Пілотки такі, як у наших солдатів.
Пілотки?
Да.
Більше такі от?
Да, отакі обично пілотки. Тільки при того такого розлітається.
Отака, правильно пілотка?
Така, да.
This one. Зелена форма була, правильно? Зеленкувата.
Да.
So if you notice, they have to have a fair amount of information about these particular sites even before they're able to, so they know what questions that they want to ask. Notice they ask about, what type of gun, is it one shooter, how many shooters were there? And then they're interested in the uniforms that they're wearing, because that tells you, was this, who was in charge there? Was it, Germans doing the shooting? Was it locals that were doing the shooting? All of that creates a more, like I said, a fuller picture of what these actions look like, and especially understanding the degree to which locals were enlisted and participated in these actions. And you see they had like a picture there so he can point out which hat, which uniform he remembers these men wearing. And think about, this particular man was interviewed in Ukraine in a space that had been occupied by the Soviets, was Soviet territory. Then the Germans come in. This is someone who probably saw a lot of uniforms in his young life. And so, again, his ability to recall it's helped by showing a picture and really describing, who was there, so we can understand this. In the early days of the invasion of Operation Barbarossa, the first places that they'll go are Eastern Poland. That sect that's stripped there on the east that you can see had previously been occupied by the Soviets. That's the first territory that will then experience this invasion, the first place where these shootings will happen. And in some cases, like, the procedure isn't as standardized as it will become later on. Here's some photos from Lviv, where the Germans come in and they encourage the locals to attack their Jewish neighbors. And you can see this woman is being chased through the streets after being beaten pretty badly. And she's being chased by 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 locals. You can see the young boy there with a club who's chasing her. So again, this also makes us think about the anti-Semitism of locals that was unleashed by the presence of the Germans. Another location in this territory that had previously been held by the Soviets is Vilna. So this was a community, you can see the location there, and then a bit of a zoomed in map. Vilnius was or Vilna as it was called at the time, was a really significant Jewish community. It had been for centuries, often called the Jerusalem of the East. Really rich, vibrant Jewish life that took place there. And much of that was destroyed during the Holocaust. So if you look on the map, you can see the city, and then the red dots are Panar or Panar, the site where these shooting actions took place. It's just about less than 10 miles from the city center. And you can see right next to it, there's a railroad station where the Jews would be unloaded. So we'll listen to a little bit of testimony from a witness who talks about the unloading of those cars. They will be taken to these pits that had been dug to hold Soviet fuel for airplanes. So the Germans often repurposing, whether in a natural ravine or these pits that were dug for fuel. It saves digging time. So you can see people are being brought down to these pits where they'll be shot, and the soldier in the foreground there that you see, that's a Lithuanian soldier who's helping with this killing action. So I'll show you play a little bit of this clip where he's talking about the unloading at the railroad station.
А так вот эти, которые охраняли, они в том же самом вагоне, как и евреи бывали, или у них какой-то отдельный вагон, или может вообще они на ступеньках? Да, охрана.
Не, они это я же говорю как. С досок были такие тамбуры поделаны, и с двух концов вагона охраняли. Это так же, как в Германию увозили тоже вот. Площадки были поделаны с конца там вагона, и все. И окна колючей проволокой знают, что были забиты, а двери закрыты бывают.
А где остановился поезд? В станции Панеряй или где-то дальше?
В Панеряй.
It stopped in Панеряй.
Вот. Хотя была ветка, и уже к этим ямам была ветка, но там была широкая колея русская, и что, не переделана. И выгружали в Панеряй на вокзале, на станции выгружали. Когда первый эшелон привезли, их, сколько там, 20, 30 нет, откуда, 20-25 вагонов, может, больше там не было. И сразу открыли и стали гнать этих евреев. Это евреев только с Кавнаса или откуда их привезли, не знаю. И у этих полицаев, у них там, говорит, в винтовках патронов не было. И стали разбегаться. Так эти в Панеряй тут было все услано трупами. Когда, банда там бежала, так куда ж там. А кто убежал, тот убежал. Так потом уже стали привозить, там 2 или 3 эшелона еще были. Так уже по одному вагону их выгружали, только вагон выгрузят, пригонят, расстреляют, и тогда дальше пошли. А уже сразу, чтобы полностью не открывали. Вот так было.
А где вот поезда?
And so you'll notice, and he's about to say the shooting site was quite close to the railroad station, but you notice, what he's recounting, that they adapted the process. That initially, they opened all the cars and there was chaos. People tried to escape, so they learned from that. And then they only open one at a time and take those people to the shooting site and then open another one. So again, something that is, I would say, a hallmark of the Nazi killing process is that they're paying attention to what goes right and wrong and adapting along the way. Another thing he mentions is that the railroad track continues to the pits, but that's Soviet gauge because the Soviets were there previously, so they can't. That's why they have to unload at the train station and not just take them directly to the pits. That additional, less than like a quarter of a mile, because the train tracks are different. So this is a testimony of a woman who she's taken to Panar she's taken to Panar, and she's young. She's a young child, and she survives, which is really quite rare. I'm going to play two videos of people who survive these actions. It's really rare for people to survive an Einsteins Group and shooting action, so the fact that we have a couple of them is really pretty unique. She is a child, and you'll hear how she her experience here.
לקראת ערב הגענו למקום שם לפנר. ואז ראינו שם שיש כבר בורות. הבורות היו כבר מוכנות. וברור שידענו שזה לא, שאנחנו לא נשארים פה, שאנחנו לא עובדים. הם עקפו אותנו מסביב, זאת אומרת, עם הכלבים. לקחו אותנו באמצע, ומסביב עם כלבים עמדו על ידינו. אמרו לנו להתפשט ולשים את הדברים במקום אחד. כל אחד התחיל להתפשט. אני התפשטתי ולא לגמרי. אמרו די, נשארתי עם שמלה ונעליים. הסבתא והדודה שהייתה איתי, הם היו צריכים להתפשט לגמרי. ואז לקחו 10 נשים, כל 10 נשים, צבו ללכת לבור, למד על יד הבור, ושם היו כבר האוטומטים, זה הכלי הריגה. עם האלה שישבו שם. היינו צריכים לעמוד 10 אנשים, הם היו, וזה היה על יד הבור. ואנחנו, וירו בהם, והם נפלו. אני הייתי כמעט בין האחרונים. ואז הגעתי לבור, ירו בנו ונפלתי. היו כבר הבור היה מלא. אני נפלתי בקצה, שהיו כבר הרבה אנשים, ואני הייתי ממש למעלה, בקצה. ואז הסתכלתי וראיתי הכל מה שזאת אומרת, ישבתי, זאת אומרת, התהפכתי איך זה שלו, והתיישבתי על המתים. הרבה אנשים הם פגעו, ויש אנשים שלא פגעו, ובגלל זה כל הזמן בבור היו בכי, וכל אחד, היו ממש היום ונורא, אי אפשר לסבול היה בכי, וביקשו, אז זאת אומרת שרחמים, ובאו אחר כך את הנאצים, ועוד פעם הם שמעו שיש אנשים עוד חיים, אז הם באו וירו בהם. 7. בת 7 הייתי.
And this is the site of Panar today. Following, towards the end of the war, when the Germans were clearly losing, they sent out additional commandos to these killing sites they'd been to where bodies were buried. They had people exhume those bodies and burn them. And so now many of these massacre sites are emptied. Panar is one such case. You can see what it looks like and what the killing was looking like at the time. There's now a memorial there. Initially after the war, the Soviets put up a memorial because this fell back into Soviet territory, talking about the death of citizens from Lithuania and, victims of fascism, that sort of thing. The Jewishness was really erased. It wasn't until the 90s that this is turned back over to the Jewish community of Vilnius. And there's proper memorialization to note that the vast majority of the people killed at this site were Jewish. Babiara is one of them that I mentioned earlier. This is one of the largest, if not the largest, shooting actions over a 2-day period. In September of 1941, where over 33,000 people were killed. You can see this ravine is where the bodies were placed, this natural occurring ravine. And this is a woman who also survives this killing action. Now, unlike the testimony we just heard, she was a young woman at the time. She was a mother. She had her child with her. And so she will describe what this process was like for her.
Рваться Крещатик. И там оно и сейчас, но оно уже не работает. Когда 28 числа, когда повесили приказ о том, чтобы явиться, мы все собрались вместе. Все.
И поняли тогда, что будет...
Никто ничего не понимал.
Да.
Все вообще думали, что нас будут куда-то вывозить, выселять. Никто себе не мог представить, что такое может быть, что люди могут такое сотворить, что люди могут живых людей закапывать в землю.
Да. А что случилось тогда?
Случилось так, что мы утром тоже так, как было написано, так мы...
Да. Пошли.
Так мы и пошли.
Что взяли с собой?
Все наше богатство, что было, что мы могли взять с собой. Дети.
Да. Документы.
Дети, документы и тряпки на себя,
да.
И все.
Да.
И потом мы пошли.
Да.
Пошли по... Не помню. Мы вышли на улицу Артема. И из всех улиц, из всех переулочков, как речка, как струйки, соединялись и присоединялись люди. И все шли, никто не думал, никто не верил, никто не мог понять, куда мы идем и что это будет с нами. Когда мы дошли уже до кладбища, до этого тупика, мы увидели, что там уже было так, стояли уже полицаи, или как назвать, не знаю. Мы уже проходили сквозь строй, и когда мы зашли, мы уже поняли, что произошло. Нас там как-то, я уже не помню точно, но нас как-то провели немножко вперед, потом сказали вещи все положить и раздеться.
Вы носили
Мы...
сына тогда, он одел?
Я на руках, у меня был сын.
Сын был на руках.
И причем ложить надо было так, вещи отдельно, документы и вещи. А еду, которую мы брали, отдельно надо было положить. Мы все это положили, все раздеться, мы разделись и пошли. И пошли, сколько мы шли, я не знаю, как мы шли, я не знаю. У меня был ребенок на руках, и родители, вот тут мы порастерялись. Уже мы не очень были вместе, но все-таки потом мы снова как-то себя нашли, потом мы стали проходить через какие-то стояло полицейские этих немцев очень много. Очень много немцев, они стояли, как коридор сделали. И мы сквозь этот коридор проходили, и они нагайками нас всех били. И толкали толкали, чтобы пройти. Кто старался пройти как-то иначе, собаками возвращали. И проходили они все время всех били. Я только спрятала ребенка своего, чтобы меня били не его. И мы оказались, еще прошли куда-то как-то, и мы оказались над самым рвом. И когда мы подошли уже ближе, вот, и когда мы шли, мы уже услышали и стрельбу, и все, мы все поняли. И когда мы нас раздели, когда нам это все, мы все поняли, что мы шли уже на смерть. Люди кричали, люди с ума сходили. И вообще нельзя передать всех этих ужасов, какие пришлось увидеть и пережить. И когда начали стрелять, люди стали падать в эти ямы. Стреляли с другой стороны какой-то. Не стреляли в затылок, а стреляли в грудь, в голову, везде. Первым упал папа, а я видела, как папа упал и потянул маму с собой. Потом сестры, а потом я уже не помню. Я не помню, я только пришла в себя тогда, когда была ночь, и было холодно. И я от холода пришла в себя, на мне была тяжесть большая. Я вернуться не могла, тяжесть трупов на мне лежала. Я несколько раз приходила в себя, а потом снова, видно, теряла сознание. Ребенок был у меня, но он был уже холодный. Потому что на мне была тяжесть, и моя тяжесть его задушила. И он уже умер не от пули. И ночью я все-таки пришла в себя, как-то стала выбираться из-под трупов, из-под этой тяжести. Когда я выползла, там же крутые овраги, там выбраться очень трудно. Я не знаю, кто мне помог, или Бог мне помог, кто мне помог. Я все-таки выбралась наверх, голая, в одной рубашке. Куда идти? Там дальше стояли, недалеко от этого яра стояли домики крестьянские, там прежде был больше такой пригородный район. Я подошла к этому домику, зашла во двор и постучалась в дверь, и я снова потеряла сознание. Я пришла в себя, когда я уже была в доме, она меня обливала водой, эта старушка. И приводила меня в сознание.
You'll know. You'll notice in both cases with this woman and the previous one, and I think it's true of all the survivor testimony from Einsteins Group and shooting that I've seen, you can see the trauma of their experience is still so visibly with them. The way that they breathe, the way that it physically takes a toll to tell this story. Today, the site of Babiara does have a memorial on it. After the war, again, when this was Soviet territory, the site, the ravine where now immediately sort of towards the end of the war, those commandos did come back. They exhumed the bodies, they burned them. So it was more just like ash and bone that was left. But then in the Soviet period, that ravine was dammed up, flooded, there's mudslides, so then it's eventually filled in. So today that ravine no longer exists. Instead, there's a park there. There had been brief talk during Soviet times of building an amusement park on this ground. That did not happen. And in 1976, there was a memorial built to the citizens of Kiev. Again, not recognizing the overwhelming Jewish nature of the victims here. And then in post-Soviet times in 91, there's more efforts, and eventually there's a research center built on this site that now properly recognizes that the vast majority of the victims were Jewish. Last year, this site was in the news again when during the Russian invasion, a TV tower that was very near the site was hit by the Russians. This next video shows you, gives you a sense of the scope and the dedication of these killing units. So if you see, look on the map here, this is down by the Black Sea. It's in a mountain town. It's a relatively small town. And the number of victims at this particular killing site is just 20. And so this is a woman who was a small child at the time, and she will describe what she saw.
Вот, например, сегодня они вошли, а вчера евреи там, евреи проходили, тоже беженцы, наверное, евреи. Вот, они переночевали тоже, и только они сегодня ушли на перевал, через перевал вот сюда они хотели на MCHE и туда, на побережье. Вот. Только они ушли сегодня утром, а немцы вечером подошли. Вот. И тоже что-то заложил. Значит, они часть остались этого же человека, расстреляли, а часть пошли, догнали евреев. И всех уложили. Всех. Потому что им некуда было спрятаться. Через перевал, вы знаете перевал, что это перевал? Вот через перевал сюда обрыв, речка, а туда гора. Им никак нельзя. Вот они их догнали и всех по одному расстреляли. Мы никто ж не знаем, что там было, как там было. Ну, факт тот, что вот где же эта могилка была, тут Зеленчук же, речка течет. И вот по Зеленчуку, по этой речке, плыли трупы вот этих евреев. И мячики даже, вот, дети же были. Вот, у них там или сеточка была, или сумочка, или это, помню. И вот детишечки с игрушкой шли. А мне так хотелось, я что запомнила, что мне так хотелось мячик, он голубой, и половина голубой, половина, кажется, большие такие вот, помните, у нас в детстве были. Вот мне так, это, я мячик хочу, там меня под затыльник, тут горе такое, а мне мячик хочется. Вот она мне под затыльник, замолчи. Ну, вот я тогда расплакалась, так они, вот. И вот это они вернулись, это ж те, и утром и куда-то ж пошли опять через перевал сюда.
А тела вот евреев, которых поубивали, они по реке, по течению текли, и они где-то были заблокированы, или вы так и видели, что они протекали?
Протекали, я не знаю, все они протекали, или может там же...
And so what you'll notice from her testimony is one, how very much this is from a child's perspective, right? The thing that she very clearly remembers is the fact that she wanted the toys that were from the kids that had been killed. And you know, her mother like hits her because she like, you're not thinking about the tragedy. Of course, how could she? You know, she's a small child. The other thing that you'll notice that she says at the very beginning is that the Jewish people killed there were refugees. They were not original to the town. So this represents, and this is true of many of the victims of the southern eastern area, they came there during the first months of the war. So people who fled knowing what was happening, you know, they could, you know, try and flee ahead of the German army, thinking that they had gotten away, that they were, you know, deep enough into Soviet territory that they'd be safe. And of course, that isn't the case. And think too, like I said about the dedication, that they're willing to send this you know, group of shooters to this relatively difficult mountain town, just for the sake of killing 20 people. So as I mentioned previously, the killing actions are mostly taking place with bullets, they're shooters. And yet there's a lot of problems with this type of killing. One is it's expensive. Bullets are expensive. There's a war on. To spend, a bullet for every person it adds up. Another consideration in this process is that the men doing the shooting, it was taking a psychological toll on them, especially they were especially concerned about the Germans who were doing the shooting, because they're thinking about it in terms of resources. And if every single soldier and policeman that they use for these shooting actions, if this is somehow psychologically damaging them so that they're no longer able to function in that capacity or another wartime capacity, then that's getting expensive as well. So they're seeing the people as resources too. And so they look for other methods of killing that would be more efficient, cheaper, and easier on the killers, essentially. So one of the methods that they try out are gas fans. And so you can see, the premise is that the exhaust is cycled back into the hold where the people are held. There are problems with this method as well. There's a different amount of gas produced based on how fast you drive. So sometimes they arrived at the site where they were going to dump the bodies and not everyone was dead. And it still meant that, largely the Germans are the ones pulling out the bodies and dealing with that aspect, which still was difficult. So while it's a little less personal than shooting, it certainly wasn't perfect, and it still required people to go out to the territories rather than what they'll eventually evolve to are stationary gas chambers. So they like this method of killing by gas. It's something they've tried previously, and they're going to, as we know, use that form when they establish the 6 killing centers throughout Eastern Territory. Helmno is one of the death camps that will always use gas fans. So they don't have stationary gas chambers, they have gas trucks. And so they will pick the people up at that have been collected at Helmno and then drive them around a track or out into the road. And that's how that camp essentially functions. This is one town where gas fans were used. And I'll just play a tiny bit of this. You can see this woman. She's Ukrainian. Well, her father was Jewish. She's in Ukraine territory. Her father was Jewish. Her mother was Ukrainian. And that eventually makes it possible for her to escape. Just see a little bit of her.
Сказать, мы это попозже почитаем. Просто вкратце, что вы помните, вот как вы первый раз немцев
Они
увидели?
пришли, да. Нас же разбомбило, мы пошли жить Пушкинской 65 к бабушке, папиной мамы. Там жили. А потом пришло извещение в декабре. Они пришли где-то к осени, вот так, по-моему. А извещение пришло, что 16 декабря все евреи собрались. Они там говорили, я-то ребенком была, но говорили, что в другой город нас будут, что-то вот так. Ну и у кого что было, а кушать же нечего было. И папа собрал бабушку, собрал меня, саночки взял, это же было декабрь, тогда зимы не такие были теплые, как сейчас. И, и все, сухарики какие были, маку взял и меня за ручку, я за саночки держалась и за руку его, а он бабушку под ручку, маму свою. И мы вышли по Пушкинской вниз и по проспекту Сталина пошли, а куда идти, что мы не знали. А в конце города, в конце был завод, есть ХТЗ, знаете, да? Замечательно. И там были бараки. Тогда как-то модно было в бараках. Вот. 8 или 9 бараков было. Ну и нас туда всех привели. Они были столбы и колючая проволока окружены. И немцы вокруг ходили. Ну, большие ворота такие, большие, открывалось и нас туда. Ну, я не помню, 3-й или 4-й барак был, куда папа нас завел.
бабушка уже еле-еле шла. А кто дорогой не мог идти, немцы пристреливали. Они просто то падали, то просто уже не могли. Они пристреливали. А я все шла и думаю, собачки какие хорошие. Я и тогда сама себе ее погладить. Говорю, папа, можно ее погладить? Ну, я немцев не понимала. Можно ее погладить? Нет, кошечка, нет. Он меня кошечка все время называл. В общем, короче говоря, пришли, в бараках не было ни окон. Полы сорваны, потому что людям нечем было топить, они туда ходили. И окна посрывали. Он нашел в таком уголочке, чтобы ни окно, ничего, постелил, бабушку положил туда. И я возле нее, это было уже вечер начинал, зимой же быстро темнеет. И я возле нее, а он возле меня. Ну, в общем, меня в серединку. Но каждое утро он меня поднимал. Приходили родственники, знакомые, приносили теплую одежду своим родственникам, ну, там, знакомым. Может, кто там, если бы была у меня мама, то я бы не попала туда, она была украинка. Но у кого тоже ж такие семьи были, национальности, да. Так он бабушку оставлял, конечно, а меня за ручку и к этой проволоке. И просил все время, заберите, а там приходили с детьми даже. Он просил, заберите мою девочку, заберите мою девочку. У нее, говорит, есть тетя, ну, это дочка сестры моей мамы, как-то так она. В общем, тетя, она украинка, говорит. Она живет на Чернышевской 4.
And so she's able to survive because her father keeps asking people to take her, and he's eventually able to sort of, smuggle her out through the fence, and a man takes her to her aunt's, and that's how she survives. And then she goes on to say that they were in this, she's smuggled out, and then about 2 weeks later, this makeshift ghetto that they were in was closed because everyone had been taken and killed in gas vans. And then you can see one of the memorials on this site. So many of the sites that I've shown you, or that JUNAMI has documented, many of them have memorials. Some of them have a few different types of memorials, and some of them have none. The last testimony from the mountain town, there is no memorial there for the 20 people who were killed. And so when we think about what this operation entailed, millions of people moving into this territory, and then of course over 1.5 million Jewish individuals, shot or killed in gas vans, we think about the large number, and then we have to think about the individuals. We think about not just those individual lives, but then also, the culture that it represented as these shooters moved into this, Jewish heartland. So very much was lost in a relatively short period of time. And so, as always, we hear just a few faces, representing all of those that were lost. But I think it does warrant a moment of just looking at these individuals in the lives that they had. Thank you for remembering.